It is imperative that the Trail of Tears Association ensure that the record of what was done to the First Nations of the southeastern United States remains as relevant a story today as it was 180 years ago.
An amazing story that the people, the ancestors of the Eastern Band, purposefully enacted and saw their way all the way through all the suffering that it took to remain here.
The Cherokee wanted to create, they wanted to communicate with themselves, but most importantly, they wanted to communicate with the world.
So ancestral Cherokee people are cosmopolitan people. They had deep and wide social networks.
One disillusioned soldier wrote that he was paid to commit a crime, to defend a fraudulent treaty with, in his words, the vilest machinations man or demon could invent.
And if you understand the Trail of Tears, and if you don't forget the Trail of Tears, when you go on to study just what happened in the 19th century after the Cherokee people got to their new homelands, picked themselves back up, and rebuilt a great society and a great democracy and a government built on the rule of law.
We don't do this to shame or blame. We do it because it's an opportunity for us to say to the world, our ancestors persevered. They had tenacity and resilience. They refused to be victims. They rebuilt the Cherokee Nation.
So I think that y'all should give yourselves a round of applause for all that you've accomplished in the last 25 years.
You didn't sign up to be warriors in this battle. Your efforts to speak plainly about the Trail of Tears, to preserve the history, helps push back on this nonsense. So we are bringing back the history course for the Cherokee people, by the Cherokee people, so that this generation of Cherokees coming up will know their own history.
A lot of people are now starting to do this kind of research, historians, archaeologists, native researchers, and looking at those stories that haven't been told, right? Certainly there's been a lot written about the removal, the Cherokee removal and other ones, but they often have to do with the leaders in these nations. They have to do with the trail itself, right? The trail that went on to Oklahoma. But these stories are a little harder to sort of parse out. But you know, people are starting to find out that there are dozens of these examples, including in the Cherokee Nation, in the Old Nation, of groups of dozens or a few hundred people staying behind, right? And this is an extraordinary story because these are people who organized and outlasted both the edict of the federal government, but also the U.S. Army, right? This is an extraordinary tale. So that's initially what sort of got me interested. And then I started reading about some of these individual families, right? Again, it's interesting when you read this because you know a lot about not only large populations, but actually individual families and individual people, so it becomes very personal. And so I started learning about the Welch family, and they were unusual in western North Carolina in the 1830s. You know, this is in the northern part of the Cherokee Nation in the 1820s and 30s. Unusual for several reasons, right? John Welch was a Cherokee man. He was married to Elizabeth or Betty Welch, a white woman. That wasn't so unusual, but what was really interesting is that they, in the 1820s and 30s, ran a large southern plantation in the mountains of North Carolina. And in the Cherokee Nation, at least in this part, it was very unusual, right? You had sort of strongholds of traditional Cherokees who were, mostly rejected Christianity, rejected surplus wealth, right? They didn't sort of buy into capitalism. They were practicing the harmony ethic. They were involved in town-level governance, right? They were rejecting sort of the Cherokee Nation as this large body, this large government. And so they ran this big plantation. They farmed about 150 acres. They raised livestock, and they enslaved at the time of removal 9 African Americans. So this is a really unusual family, right, within this group of traditional Cherokees. It becomes even more interesting when the removal really got to that point in the summer of 1838 and hundreds of Cherokees are fleeing into the mountains, that the Welches actually help some of those people survive, right? They send them food and clothing and information about where troops are and things like that. And it's interesting from the perspective that they could have actually sort of ridden out the removal without much problem, right? There was a white person in the family. Whiteness gave those people a lot of privilege, right? They also had an exemption pass, and John Welch claimed U.S. citizenship through the 1819 reservation, through his reservation, and I'll talk about that briefly. So, you know, why did they risk their livelihood and their lives to help these people, right? Especially when they seem to be sort of from this different kind of background, right? Or they have this different interest or ideology. And so that's one of the questions I asked, you know, what is this relationship that these people are you know, how are they practicing that? I was also interested in why out of a tribe of about 16,000 people, you know, 300 or 400 made this effort to actually run to the mountains and hide and stay behind. I won't talk about that too much because Brett actually covered that very well a couple of nights ago, and he described it in much better terms than I could. I'll touch on it briefly. But this is what I was interested in, right? So in my book research, I start during the removal and I go through sort of the narrative, right? Using the historic documents, mostly Army records. And we see very clearly what's happening between all these different communities, including the Welches. And then I look at what happens after the removal, and the Welch family actually creates this space, this physical space that becomes known as Welchestown on their farm. And you know, between 90 and 125 Cherokees actually lived there for about 15 years after removal. So I go into that story as well. And so, you know, I'm interested in, you know, we can think about, especially after the removal, the Welch farm is about 1,300 acres. They actually buy a lot more land. They have to buy their own farm back after the removal. But they create a space, and there are basically sort of 3 communities living on that farm, right? You have the Welch family themselves. You have Welchestown, sort of up in an elevated area in the mountains. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you have this small enslaved African-American community of 8, 9, 10 individuals, right? And so I also kind of talk about that. How are these different groups interacting with each other? All right, so just a very brief background. I'm sure you all are familiar with this, but just to sort of set the context, this is the Cherokee Nation up until 1838. And so, you know, you have the districts that were set up by the Cherokee Nation, and in those first decades of the 19th century, this schism is forming, you know, within the Cherokee Nation. The vast majority of Cherokees are, you know, want to remain traditional, and they want to maintain town-level governance and the clan system and matrilineal descent, and, you know, all of these things that are seen as sort of traditional practice. But there's this small but powerful minority that want to westernize. And whether that is, you know, as an effort to avoid any more land cessions, or whether it's because some people want to gain that you know, personal wealth, that begins to happen, right? And so you have this sort of schism that is developing as the years lead up to the removal. From an archaeological standpoint, this is really interesting because all those differences, right, ideological and cultural differences, are often reflected in material culture. And so, for example, in the top left, this is that famous photograph of the swimmer cabin that James Mooney photographed in 1888, you know, 50 years after the removal. You know, a small single-room log cabin that served very well for most Cherokee families, right? The purpose of housing was fine. In the top right, this is Joseph Van's house in northern Georgia, you know, one of the largest plantations in the Cherokee Nation, I guess the largest one, in the 1820s and into the 1830s, right? And then sort of everything in between that. In the bottom left, even small items, you know, like pottery and things that you have in your house. On the bottom left, this is a handmade Cherokee pot. Archaeologists call it, you know, the Koala series. And all through the 19th century, into the 20th century, and actually up to the present day, Cherokee women continued to make their own pottery, right? In the 19th century, it was very utilitarian, as opposed to, on the bottom right, this is a piece of china or pearlware that we found at the Welch site. It's called blue shell edge. It was produced in England. And so this is obviously a very different kind of serving dish. And not only is it produced somewhere else and purchased as opposed to made by, you know, making it by hand, But it represents this very different idea about how you dine, right? If you're European, if you're in this Western culture, you have individual dining sets, and you all sit down as a family and eat together, and everybody has their own, fork and spoon and plate and everything. And for Cherokees at the time, for most Cherokees, it was much more sort of a communal thing. And so these artifacts can actually represent very different sort of cultural practices. All right, so the white supremacist, Andrew Jackson, enabled and signed the Indian Removal Act. And as Dr. Sant talked about earlier this morning, the timing of the IRA, the Indian Removal Act, was not random or coincidence, right? This is the beginning of the antebellum period when cotton is becoming king, that land is incredibly fertile, and so those two phenomena, right, the enslavement of African Americans and that expansion in the Deep South for cotton production and Indian removals are part and parcel of the same movement, right? And Jackson benefited from both of those. Of course, for each of those southeastern removals, a treaty had to be signed. Most of those were fraudulent, including the Treaty of New Echota for the Cherokees, signed by people who were not in any official capacity in the Cherokee national government. All right, so here is the route. This is a map I grabbed from the web, right? But this route of removal, the water routes and the overland routes and everything. And of course, the goal of the federal government to be carried out by the U.S. Army was to, completely erase the presence of Cherokees and other tribal people in the Southeast, right? And to a certain extent that was true, but what you don't see in this map is that it wasn't completely carried out, right? And so again, I talk about those several hundred people who stayed behind, and many formed the basis for the modern Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So this is my study area, the very southwestern tip of North Carolina. Oddly named Cherokee County, as soon as most of the Cherokees were moved to Oklahoma, right? Let me see if I can get a pointer. So if you can see, this is a digital elevation model. So elevations are reflected by different colors. And so on the very top, those dark browns, those are the high mountain ranges. That's the Snowbird Mountains. These are the Nantahala Mountains down here. And then as you get to the lighter greens, that's lower elevations. And so this is the Valley River Valley, running all the way down until you get to the Hiwassee River, which of course is now Hiwassee Reservoir. And that red circle is the Welch Farm or Welch Plantation site where we did excavations. So in the Treaty of New Echota stipulated that removal had to begin in the spring of 1838. By that time, General Winfield Scott is assigned to carry out that task. And when he arrives, he writes to the Cherokees, right? He's afraid that they're going to take up arms like the Seminole were doing in Florida. And so he writes that literally, just because we're not shooting at you, don't think this isn't a war, right? The United States is at war with the Cherokee Nation, and we're taking this seriously, right? This is going to happen. We have a lot of Army records, including, things like sketches. A lot of officers were keeping daily journals and things like that. So we have all these different kinds of records that tell us from the Army perspective what was going on. Now that 2-year period, right, from the spring of 1836 until the fall of 1838, the U.S. Army was tasked with all these different kinds of things, right? On the surface, it looked like they were just being prepared. They were preparing to move these 16,000 people to the west, but they were actually doing these other things, right? They were recording, first of all these detailed maps of where Cherokee houses were because they were afraid that there would be a rebellion. They were recording all the wealth, the improvements, farm improvements by the Cherokees, because they were supposed to be able to claim land that they lost or improvements that they rarely ever received because they couldn't prove that they had made those improvements. But so, for example, this is one of the cartographic maps that they drew, and so, here we go. So down here, this dark line is the Valley River, and then you can see the line that they're shooting with their compass and steel chain, and then this little square is the Welch House from 1838. So we have all these different kinds of records, right? So they recorded basically the farm complexes of all the Cherokees in western North Carolina. This is a transcribed version of the Welch plantation. And this is at a time, if you read that top paragraph, their house, they describe it as, a pretty substantial log house, valued at about $190 at a time when the average Cherokee house was valued by them at $8 or $10 or $12 or something like that. So this is a big sort of plantation house they're living in. But then if you look at the next line, one hewed log kitchen, 14 by 14, puncheon floors, stick and clay chimney. Remember that because we're going to come back to that when I talk about the archaeology in a few minutes. This was a big undertaking by the Army because they had to basically prepare the ground for settlement by white people, right? There were no private property boundaries. There was really not much known about the resources in the area. So as the armies went through there and mapped everything, they didn't only put down where the houses were, the Cherokee houses and townhouses. They actually put where there were good seats for mills, right, on the waterways, where there were iron ore outcrops, where there were a good stand of timbers, things like that. And so they were preparing for people to come in and take over these lots that would be sold by the state of North Carolina. So they actually had a lot to do to prepare not only to get the Cherokees to vacate the area, but to prepare it for settlement or resettlement. So the Snowbird Mountain Range, north of Valley River, right? If you've been up there, this is a really steep set of mountain ranges, these really narrow sort of hollers that you can get lost in pretty easily. And so those 400 people ran into the mountains, right? And again, as Dr. Riggs talked about the other night, this wasn't just people panicking and running into the mountains. This had been, sort of a long preparation, but they fled when they had to in, early summer of 1838. And pretty quickly, they realized, who was assisting these people. And so the Welch plantation site, and John and Betty in particular, of course, become suspect. And they actually start camping out around the house to try to capture people who are sneaking in to get food and things like that. And so for the first time, the Welch family, is on the radar of Winfield Scott as people who need to be watched and sort of taken care of. So I won't go into this. I was going to talk about it in a little bit more detail. It's probably better that I don't because I might run out of time anyway. But Brett talked about this in some detail. And if you heard Bill Jergelski's talk last night, he talked a lot about the reservations basically. But if you look at those people who were involved in the resistance in 1838, right, and I'll mention some of those names, it's many of the same people who were taking those reservations in 1819 and reestablishing these old towns, right? Settling on these old towns like Niquosi. And so if you're interested in that, Brett's thesis covers that, but Bill's dissertation actually goes into a lot of detail about the reservees and about how that was sort of planned and how it ends up. So this is a map of, or a copy of a map of Fort Cass in 1838. And so Winfield Scott, of course, finds himself on the ground with 7,000 soldiers in a tribe of 16,000 people or so. So, there's one soldier for every, 2 people on the ground, basically. He is overseeing this concentration camp, right, this POW camp. People are coming in every day. So he has this large-scale process, right, that he's trying to be in charge of. But then he's also realizing that something else is happening right up on Valley River and in the mountains above there. And so in the summer of 1838, John Welch, his oldest son Ned, Junaluska and his brother Wachacha, and a white man called Gideon Morris, who is married to Junaluska and Wachacha's sister, all ride into the fort to claim money that's owed to them by the federal government, right? Most of them were reservees, and so they're claiming all these funds that they are owed, and they think that they are safe, right? As soon as they ride in, Winfield Scott has them all arrested, except Gideon Morris because he's white. And those 4 men are thrown into the prison there in Fort Cass, and Ned and Wachacha and Junaluska are eventually released, although Junaluska and Wachacha are put on the trail, and they return eventually. John Welch is actually held just about until the Army actually leaves in November. And by the time he's released, he's blind, he's permanently disabled, he had contracted some kind of disease, and there's some hint in the paperwork that he was beaten or somehow abused by officers in the jail, right? Gideon Morris rides back to the Valley River as quickly as he can. He warns everybody there, the Welch family, the Morrises, that the Army is coming to arrest everybody, right? And in that case, Betty Welch is in charge of the farm. You know, her husband and her oldest son have been arrested. She has a lot of children who are pretty small. She's pregnant with her last child. The Army shows up and they try to arrest Betty, and she basically says, you can't arrest me. And I don't know what her defense was, if it was because she was pregnant or because she was white or whatever her performance was, they couldn't arrest her. So they decided, and she had sent her children to South Carolina to avoid removal because their father was Cherokee, and so they were Cherokee, right? So they could have arrested the children if they had been able to catch them. So the only thing they can do is actually arrest the enslaved individuals who they own, right? Those 9 slaves who the Welches have owned. So we have the names of most of the people who were arrested, right, who were owned by the Welches. Isaac and Nellie and Phyllis were all adults. Nellie had a 10-year-old girl called Jane, and when the Army got there, she had just given birth to a baby about 10 days before that. So there was a newborn baby, and Phyllis had 4 children. We don't know exactly what their ages were. So they arrest them, they march them the 80 miles across the Long Ridge down to Fort Cass. By the time they get down there, Nellie, her newborn, and one of Phyllis's sons has died on the trail, right? And they're buried in unmarked graves somewhere. We don't know where those graves are, right? So this tremendous loss for this small community. So the removal happens, right? This large-scale removal that Scott had been in charge of. Most of those detachments are taking off in late summer, early fall. And then as Brett talked about a couple nights ago, that occupation by military force of the Cherokee Nation ends in November of 1838 with the Solly Affair. Scott and all of his officers are ready to wash their hands of it. They are ready to leave. And so they pull out, and at that point, very warily, right, these several hundred people begin to sort of come out of the mountains. And this is the state that they're in, right? A head man of one of the local communities, Dick Agishka, wrote this in one of his claims a few years after removal. You know, and I think this represents pretty accurately what most of those 400 people dealt with. You know, when they were in the mountains hiding from the Army, they were dealing with starvation and illness and maybe hypothermia. And so, you know, they were losing, you know, small children, they were losing the elderly. And we know from, not so much from military records, but from William Holland Thomas's records, right, a local store owner who was just, luckily for historians, this obsessive record keeper. He interviewed all the people who were up there, or most of them, and, you know, how many people were in the family, where they lived before the removal, where they lived after the removal, and how many people in their family died while they were up there. And almost every family lost at least 1 or 2 individuals, right? Mostly young children and elderly people. But they lost, from his accounting, they also lost about 30% of their population while they were hiding, right? So again, this tremendous loss as they're coming out of the mountains. They come down to this new sort of social reality, right? Most of their tribes people are gone, right? Where there were thousands of people, now there are a few hundred. They are considered to not be members of the Cherokee Nation or the United States or the state of North Carolina. It's illegal for them to own land, and so they are in their own country, but they have no rights or privileges whatsoever. And so this is where people like the Welches, and Brett the other day talked about George Washington Hayes, right? These people, white people, non-Cherokees who are allies to these people. They start setting up shop basically and providing land and food and things like that. And so this is what I talk about, right, in my research, the Welch family and the Welchestown. And so this is, let me see if I can get my pointer. So this is another digital elevation model. It basically shows elevation changes. And so down here, this narrow white line is the Valley River. So like I said, the Welches had to actually go to the state auction and repurchase all of their land, but instead of purchasing about 400 acres, they purchased about 1,300 acres. And so this black line is the property that they owned in 1839 after the removal had just ended, right? So what's interesting, you know, if you look at some of the names on modern day maps, you know, you have Welch Mill Creek, and down at the bottom there is an old mill that the Welches had built and run in the 1820s. But even more interesting, this branch right next to it is called Townhouse Branch. And so again, you know, if you heard the talk this morning here about about townhouses and structures, this is a pretty good giveaway that this is where Welch's Town was created, right? So the Welches, after the removal, purposefully bought an extra 800 acres up in this elevated area that they had never really needed before, but you've got enough or flat or level land in these two areas to basically rebuild a community for 100, 120 people, and you actually even have a townhouse over here. And we have quite a few records that talk about not specifically the location of Welch's Town, but that Welch's Town, that community, is on Welch property, right? I did some survey up there when I was working to excavate on the Welch farm site. I couldn't get into Townhouse Branch, unfortunately, because the landowners didn't want me to get in there. Fair enough. I went into Welch Mill Creek and started to do some excavations looking for these houses by members of Welch's Town. I was in there on the wrong time and it was very snaky, so I ran away and didn't get a chance to come back, right? So hopefully at some point I can go back and work on that, because it would be an interesting comparison between the Welch plantation and some of these Welch's Town households. Let's see, let me check my time. All right. So we know a lot about Welch family genealogy, of course, and so this is the family in, I think, 1839. And you can see, Stacy was Betty's last child. She was pregnant with Stacy when the removal happened, when those soldiers showed up. Her next youngest child, Lloyd, later on became one of the early chiefs of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. We also have a lot of information about who actually lived at Welch's Town through time, right, starting in 1839 and going all the way up to about 1855. Again, thanks to William Holland Thomas, you can go to the Duke University Special Collection archives, and they have volumes and volumes and volumes of his papers, right? He just recorded everything, basically, so luckily for us. But we have people like Dick Agishka, who wrote in his claim about how many people were lost during hiding in the area. We have people like Old Axe, Edaconahay, names that show up in this community, and some of these names were showing up in 1819 on the reservations. We have photographs of some of these people. This is John Axe and Annie Axe, Edaconahay, and Sadayi. And these photographs were taken in 1888, also by James Mooney, the anthropologist, exactly 50 years after the removal, right? And so they were a young couple at the time of removal. They were hiding in the mountains, and in 1839 they moved down and were members of Welch's Town, right? So we know quite a bit about people like the Axes and the Owls. So we did a lot of this background research, and then we wanted to try to do some archaeology, right? We had spent a lot of time in the field looking for the Welch House. We couldn't find it. This is a really big sort of level floodplain. The soils down there are really rich. There are a lot of places to look for a house, until just by coincidence, a friend of mine said, "Oh, have you looked at that 1860 gold survey map of Valley River?" And I had never heard of it, and so he got a copy to me. And there are a couple things here that are important. So this is in 1860. Again, remember the Army went through in 1837 and 1838 and created those maps. So here again we have the Valley River. We have Welch's Mill Creek coming down there. And then you have the public road, or what was called the state road, making this curve. And then you have the Welch House, which is an L shape in 1860, right? So this kind of becomes important when we start excavating. But basically we started looking at aerial photographs in the area and saw that we had this tree line that has that sort of S-curve like that. And so we went out and started doing metal detector survey in this field and found it in about an hour, right? It was right there. So I think we probably would have never found it without that specific map, right? So this is a photograph looking north. So you can see the Nantahala mountain range, the Snowbird mountain range in the background. And so we did these small excavation blocks. And I think actually, Bill, you're in that one with Scott Shoemate. So Bill Dragelski was there doing a lot of excavations for me, so that was fantastic. And so this is the main thing that we found, and I hope you can see it with this photograph. But we stripped away what's called the plow zone, that area about a foot thick on the top of the ground that's turned up by the plow whenever you plow, for planting or whatever. We removed that, and then you expose what's called the subsoil, that red clay, right? And you can see down inside that if there are any features, right? So an archaeological feature is if you dig a hole like a well or a privy or a trash pit and it gets filled up with stuff, we call that a feature, right? And so you can see, if you can see these 3 rectangular outlines, they're darker soils. And so the largest one is just like that. You can see all those dark stains in there. And then we have 2 smaller ones, that one and then that one. It also has some rocks. They have rocks and things like that. And so these basically these were 3 cellar pits for storing root crops in the wintertime that were actually beneath the old kitchen that was described in 1837 or 1838 by the Army, right? And so the Welches show up on Valley River in 1822, just after they were kicked off of their reservation land in 1821. They build a house like Swimmer had, right? This single room house. They live in it until their family starts to get too large and they are making more money. And so they build this bigger house, right? This 1.5-story log house that's 2 rooms long. And they turn that old log cabin into an external kitchen in 1838, right? Or that's what shows up in 1838. The artifacts that we found from these pits, and there are a lot of artifacts in there, date to about 1848, 1850, something like that. That period in between 1838 and 1860. So what happened, these were the 3 cellar pits that were beneath the old kitchen where they were storing food. Sometime between 1838 and 1860, that old kitchen was torn down and they put on what's called a kitchen L, right? This L-shaped kitchen attached to the back of the house. And that's why the house in 1860 was shaped like an L, right? So we think this was all backfill around 1850. So this is just a sketch map of what those features look like, right? We do a lot of mapping and things like that when we're in the field to record what we're seeing. We bisect these pits on the long axis, so we draw a line down the long axis. We remove the first half so we can see the soil profile, and you can see some dark stains in the middle. That's charcoal, right? We found a lot of artifacts, but also a lot of food remains, burned bone, seeds, and peach pits and things like that. This is what it looked like after we finished excavation of the largest one. There was only one sort of intrusion, right? There was this long, narrow trench that somebody had dug in the early 20th century to put a water line in. So you can see that steel pipe running through there, but it didn't do too much damage, so it really wasn't too much of a problem. We found a lot of ceramics, right? So again, if you think back about that slide I showed at the very beginning, these different kinds of things, like the kinds of dishes that you have in your house, sort of reflect where you're purchasing, sort of the dining etiquette that you have. And we recovered hundreds and hundreds of ceramic artifacts like this shell-edged plate and a lot of this alkaline glazed stoneware that reflect purchasing, right? They're going to local stores and they're buying pottery that's shipped from England or from France, or some of it is made in North Carolina. You have this big stoneware tradition in North Carolina. A lot of eating utensils, but some other ceramic shards. So they're buying, and I think Betty is buying. She's in charge of the household. And after the removal, Betty becomes an incredibly wealthy woman, right? John Welch can't own the farm. He can't own the plantation because he's Cherokee. So Betty, basically, they sign everything over to her. She owns the plantation. She owns the slaves. She has power of attorney. So in the 1840s, when married women in this country really aren't supposed to have any power, right? They almost belong to their husband. Betty becomes this really powerful woman and wealthy woman because her husband is considered an alien by the U.S. government. And so, they have all these different kinds of colors and decorative styles and things like that in the household. We also found a lot of clothing parts, hardware, buttons and pins and things like that. We actually have a record that in the 1830s they had a loom house. They're making a lot of money by spinning and producing cloth and clothing, and we found a lot of sewing materials. We found a lot of hunting and fishing gear, musket balls, gun flints. In the middle on the top, that's a little lead bullet mold that was sort of made by hand. And then in the bottom right, this neat little, somebody took a brass pen and curved it and then cut a little sort of barb in it and used it as a fishing hook. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The only material that we found that was handmade was stuff that's usually associated with men's activities, right, in Cherokee culture at the time in the 19th century. And the best example on the right, this is one of the pipestone pipes, right? And these small sort of chlorite schist or pipestone pipes, Cherokee men would find these pebbles naturally in riverbeds and they would carve it out for smoking. And these pipes go back hundreds of years in history, right, on archaeological sites. This is a very traditional sort of form of smoking pipe. We also found carved discs. So on the other photograph in the bottom right, this is a carved piece of stone. We think it's a gaming piece, right, for the Cherokee basket game. And then in the top, those two white pieces, they're actually talc, and talc shows up naturally on the Valley River. They had a blacksmith shop, and so we think they're making these talc pencils for marking iron, for making cuts and things like that. And then some of these, you know, the long stone on the left was carved and polished. We found pieces that were incised. We don't know what they were used for, if they were gaming pieces, if they were used for something utilitarian. But it's interesting to me that all of the handmade stuff that we found would kind of be associated with John Welch, right? And all of the mass-produced stuff we found, like the dishes, are associated with Betty. And again, in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, it's very common for Cherokee women to be making pots that are used in their own household for cooking and serving and things like that. And we recovered about 700 ceramic sherds, and not one piece was handmade Cherokee pottery, right? So I think that Betty intentionally is not having Cherokee pottery in the house, even though there are probably, you know, 30 or 40 women in Welchstown, a half mile up the hill, who are making pottery, and she could easily get pottery if she wanted to, right? And so that's one of the interesting things when I was doing this research is how do we think about those gendered differences, right? How is Betty, she grew up, we think, in Cherokee society. Her father's second wife was Cherokee, right? Her brother married a Cherokee woman, and so she's certainly immersed in Cherokee culture, but it seems like she's still making some of these choices that don't completely embrace some aspects of Cherokee culture. And it might have been because they were actually trying to downplay that they were Cherokees, or downplay the fact that you had this big Welchstown group of 100 Cherokees living up there at a time and place where a lot of local white people were very racist and didn't want Cherokee people around them, right? We also have a lot of information on what they were eating, and this is really interesting, right? We expected to find all this domestic stuff, and floral and faunal preservation was very good at the site, and so we have a lot of bones from livestock, you know, from domesticated animals. We have a lot of things like corn, wheat and rye, which we expected because this was a big working plantation. But the interesting thing to me was all the wild kinds of foods that we found, right? And so, you know, if you look at this, deer, turkey, bear, fish, duck, squirrel, raccoon, all these different kinds of nuts, honey locust, elderberry, grape, bulrush, and that's not something that would commonly show up on a plantation where the people running it spend almost all of their time, raising livestock, raising crops, harvesting. You know, the wild stuff isn't really so efficient. And so one of the big questions that people have always asked about the Welch family and George Washington Hayes and William Holland Thomas, right, these sort of white allies, is what was in it for them, right? People have made arguments, including as early as the 1840s, that the Welches and other people were actually helping out the traditional Cherokees because they thought of them as this really cheap workforce, right? If they helped them stay after removal, they would be so dependent on the Welches that they could use them almost like slave labor, right? On the other side, of course, is the argument that it was very altruistic, right? That they had had these relationships with these people for at least 20 years, and they were connected to them by these different kinds of community ties, and so they wanted to help that way, right? I looked at the farm output from 1838 and 1860 for the Welch farm because the Army and then the federal census recorded that information, and there was no increase in output on the Welch farm from 38 to 60, right? So in 1850 or 1850, when you have, an extra 80 adult people living on your farm, you would think that they would be producing more stuff, right? But they're not. I think that what's happening, and I might be stretching my data a little bit, you can ask me about that, but it looks like the people of Welchstown are sort of paying the Welches back for their assistance, but it's by doing things like this, right? By bringing foods down from the mountains. I think the Cherokees of Welchstown continue a more traditional lifestyle, right? They're living in these small log cabins, they're raising corn and gardens, and they're hunting and fishing, and so they have access to a lot of these wild kinds of foods, and they're bringing some of this stuff down, and they're sharing it with the Welches, right? That may not be absolutely true, but we do know that the Welches were eating better than anybody else in the region, right? They have this amazing sort of diet that they have access to. We do have photographs of some of the family members, and so John Cobb, Lloyd, and Stacy, you know, some of the younger kids, we have photographs. We know when John Welch died only because there's this marginal notation. Betty, who couldn't write in English or in syllabary, she had her son Ned in 1850, in the mid-1850s, write another claim, you know, that they were owed by the government for lost property. And just in a marginal notation, Ned writes something like, Elizabeth Welch, widow of John, who died on July 9th, 1852. So we know the day that John Welch died, and that's about the time that the Welch's town begins to sort of come apart, right? Or not come apart, but is not really needed anymore, I think. John Welch dies in 1852. That might have been a very key tie between the Welch family and the members of Welch's town. But also in 1855, it's the first time in North Carolina that a Cherokee actually buys private property, right? Junaluska and his brother Wachacha are some of the first Cherokees to buy land. I think the only reason it happened was because in 1855, North Carolina finally surrendered and said, all right, we're not going to get rid of the Cherokees. We might as well just like let them do whatever they want to, right? They had been trying all through the 1840s to carry out what they wanted, what they called a voluntary removal. Like they wanted the Cherokees who were still in North Carolina to volunteer to get up and, you know, walk to Oklahoma, and of course they wouldn't do that. So I think, you know, John Welch dies in 1852. Cherokees realize that they're a little bit safer in 1855 and they can buy land. And so I think by then, 5 or 10 years before the Civil War starts, the people in Welch's town feel a little bit more secure, and the need for living there sort of begins to dwindle, right? And we know where they go because of William Holland Thomas. Some move to the Qualla towns, some move over to Robbinsville, you know, and sort of reoccupy Buffalo Town. Some move back to Hanging Dog just above the Valley River. And so by 1855, I think it's sort of a ghost town, right? But at the same time, you know, to go back to the beginning of my talk, I think that the amazing thing about this, in addition to the incredible narrative, right? Every time I would read another document and see another piece of this puzzle, it was really just sort of, you know, another sort of amazing discovery, is the fact that it was successful, right? That by 1855, those people who had hid, they came back down. You know, Welch's town was one of the largest communities that was reestablished by those 400, but other ones, you know, in the Qualla towns, a lot of people snuck back over to the Qualla towns, like Brett talked about the other day. But this was a success story, and again, this is, you know, a group of 300 or 400 people, in addition to the Qualla town folks, who literally outlasted a military occupying force of 7,000 soldiers, right, whose only task really was to catch these people. And they paid this extraordinarily high price, but they outlasted this occupying army, right? And to me, that's really sort of the takeaway point that I always sort of come back to, right? And that really is sort of at the heart of this story. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? All right. Any questions? So they had access to several different stores. William Holland Thomas actually had a store at what is now Andrews, which is just a couple miles away. So they're going up there and they're going down to Murphy, right? A store is down there, and they're buying coffee and rice. You know, and I think there's actually a pretty substantial trade between southern Appalachia and the Low Country, right? They're shipping things back and forth, and they're selling, you know, they're bringing things like cattle and hogs down to the Low Country to sell to plantation owners, and then things like rice are moving the opposite direction up into the High Country where you can't grow things like rice. Yeah. So I didn't mention that. Her name is Blythe, B-L-Y-T-H-E. We don't know a lot about her family. You know, we have a little bit of genealogy starting with her parents and her siblings, but it's sort of vague about when her parents moved into the Cherokee country. I don't know if, you know, but we think that she sort of grew up there, right? Certainly the family had been in the Cherokee Nation for quite some time, but other than that, we don't know a lot. They do, yeah. They do, and a lot of the people who are on that 1840 list do move back to the Qualla towns, so they move back here. And I think, as in a lot of cases, right, but especially maybe for the Eastern Band, land ownership is really complicated, of course, because you have William Holland Thomas, who's buying up all this land at the same time. You know, and then you have these smaller plots of land in Cherokee County and surrounding counties. But yeah, a lot of those folks were purchasing their own land. Yeah. There are, in the National Archives, there's a lot of documentation, and also a lot of it at Duke University where they have the William Holland Thomas papers. I don't know if he listed all of those hundreds of people, but certainly for the people who were like at the head of Valley River, you know, and hiding up in the Snowbird Mountains and things like that. I mean, it's a pretty complete list of where they lived at the time of removal or before removal, and then where they ended up after, and then how many people died while they were in hiding in the fall. No. They were, yeah, Welch's town in general was comprised of a lot of different towns that were sort of in the area. You know, you had people from Buffalo Town, from Hanging Dog, from Valley River. They were living in the area, right? There were sort of dispersed settlements on the northern part of Valley River. But then there were a few people from like Peachtree, a little bit to the southeast. I think there was a couple families from northern Georgia. So there were a few families that were a little further afield, but most were from the 4 or 5 communities sort of around the upper part of Valley River. So I don't know, the LTLT is now Mainspring, right? So I don't know, I haven't talked to the folks who run that conservancy. I know years ago they bought a lot of that property down on the riverfront, you know, where the Welch property originally abutted the Valley River. And at the time, the last time I was there, it was open for hiking and things like that. But I'm not sure. I know they have talked about trying to buy more of the old farm. I don't know if they're still pursuing that, and I don't know what the end goal is, really, to tell you the truth.